Before sunrise on May 11, 1945, a fight no one should have survived kicked off at 5:47 a.m., and it began with a blade slashing across a soldier's skull. Private First Class John R. McKini snapped awake as a Japanese saber scraped a groove through his scalp. The blow didn't split his head, but it stunned him hard enough to stagger his senses. 24 years old, barely 5'7" and 130 pounds, he looked more like a small-town farmhand than the man who would soon hold a defensive line alone against a force 100 strong. He'd grown up shooting squirrels that darted at odd angles and turkeys that never stood still longer than a heartbeat. His father had drilled one thing into him: learn to shoot fast, learn to shoot without thinking, and don't rely on sights when the target is already moving. Those childhood lessons, born in the pine woods of Screven County, Georgia, were about to decide the fate of 180 American soldiers. 8,000 miles from home, on the Luzon coast, Company A of the 123rd Infantry Regiment had formed a perimeter around a small outpost near Dingalan Bay. The jungle around them smelled of wet earth and salt air. The nighttime temperature hovered around 78 degrees. A fading moon pushed through scattered clouds, giving the canopy just enough silver light to distort shapes but not reveal them. That dim glow let an enemy crawler slip to within arm's reach. McKini had just finished a night shift, manning an M1919A4 light machine gun with 2 other soldiers. The trio had wrapped up their rotation barely 20 minutes before the attack. Exhausted, he lay 3 steps from the gun emplacement, catching a moment of rest. That was when the saber touched his skull. Shock burned away instantly. His hands moved on pure instinct. The M1 Garand lying across his chest became a blunt weapon. He swung it upward like a baseball bat. The rifle stock smashed into the attacker's face, dropping the man flat. Before McKini could even think, he racked the action and fired at a second Japanese soldier charging from the left. The rifle's crack blew across the perimeter, and the darkness around him erupted with movement. More silhouettes poured out from the tree line. One of the machine gun crewmen was already down, hit during the opening strike. The third man dragged the wounded soldier 40 yards to the rear, leaving McKini completely alone at the strongest defensive point the company had. Then came the real push. 10 Japanese infantrymen sprinted straight for the machine gun. Their assault was choreographed. 3 laid down suppressive fire, while 7 closed the last 15 yards in a dead run. They reached the emplacement before McKini could cut the distance. Worse, they grabbed the machine gun and began wrenching it around, trying to pivot it back toward American lines. McKini didn't hesitate. He lunged into the small pit, roughly 6 feet wide and 4 feet deep, reinforced with palm logs and sandbags. The 10 attackers were clustered tight around the gun. Range didn't matter. The first man was 3 feet away when McKini fired. He snapped off shot after shot, the Garand's semi-auto action letting him fire faster than their eyes could track. In less than 8 seconds, 7 enemy soldiers were down. The last 3 didn't fall back. They charged him head-on. McKini didn't have time to work the trigger. The rifle became a club again. He smashed the butt into the nearest man's skull, spun, and drove the stock into another's throat. The third lunged with a bayonet, but McKini parried, shoved the blade aside, and slammed the rifle butt into the attacker's chest. All 3 hit the floor of the pit, motionless. The machine gun was ruined. The fight inside the emplacement had jammed and bent the feed system, leaving the heaviest weapon in that sector completely dead. Brass cases, blood, and palm splinters littered the tiny space as McKini climbed out, breathing hard, head still throbbing from the saber cut. He had eliminated 10 men in under 2 minutes. And that was only the warm-up. The jungle beyond the destroyed emplacement crackled with incoming movement. Branches snapped. Orders were shouted in Japanese. The attackers weren't dispersing. They were concentrating on his side of the perimeter. They knew the machine gun position, now lost, had been the anchor of Company A's defensive line. Punching through there would unravel the whole perimeter. McKini sprinted 20 yards to a massive fallen dipterocarp tree with a 4-foot-thick trunk. It wasn't perfect cover, but it would stop rifle rounds. Grenades would be a different story. He checked his Garand, one round still chambered. He dumped the partial clip and slammed in a fresh 8-rounder. The metallic ping echoed as the clip seated. He had 7 more clips on his belt. 56 rounds total. Somewhere between 80 and 100 Japanese fighters were moving in. The odds were brutal. He stayed anyway. At 5:53 a.m., the next wave appeared. 15 men spread in a cautious line, using trees and shadows as stepping stones. This wasn't a reckless charge. This was a deliberate push by experienced troops. McKini tightened his grip, exhaled once, and waited for the nearest man to hit the 40-yard mark. Then he fired. The first shot hit center chest at 40 yards. The soldier collapsed instantly, and the rest of the attackers froze for just a split second. Long enough for McKini to shift his aim. His second round punched into another enemy at roughly 35 yards. The remaining 13 went prone, vanishing behind tree roots and jungle clutter as a storm of grenades followed. Explosions tore into the dirt behind the fallen tree. 4 blasts in quick order. Each one, the pop and roar of a Type 97 fragmentation grenade, with a fuse short enough to limit reaction time. Dirt and wood. Splinters peppered McKini's face, but none landed close enough to knock him out of the fight. While the blasts rained down, he could hear bodies moving, the attackers closing in under the noise. He rose above the trunk just long enough to fire 3 quick shots. 2 connected. 1 kicked bark off a tree trunk. Return fire snapped back instantly, hammering into the side of the fallen log. The thick wood stopped the incoming 7.7mm rounds, but it wouldn't last if they started lobbing mortars onto his position. Time to move. Staying still meant dying. He crawled 10 yards north along the log, then slipped through an 18-inch depression in the ground that offered a few seconds of concealment. He kept low, pushing toward a cluster of rocks that Company A had used as an improvised supply point. Behind the rocks, stacks of ammunition crates waited. He grabbed 2 bandoliers of 30 .06 ammo and threw them over his shoulders. Each held 60 rounds in 6 stripper clips. Between those and the Garand clips on his belt, he now carried 176 rounds. The extra weight, roughly 8 pounds, dragged at him, but running dry in the middle of a 100-man assault wasn't an option. At 5:58 a.m., the jungle changed pitch. A hollow thump rippled through the air. Knee-mortars, the Japanese Type 89 grenade dischargers, had a range of roughly 175 yards, and the enemy crews had maneuvered to angles where they could arc shells directly into the American sector. The first round slammed into the earth 30 yards from his position, throwing dirt and wet leaves skyward. The second landed 25 yards away. They were walking the fire inward, adjusting by increments. He bolted. He sprinted roughly 20 yards east, dove behind a narrow palm, and hit the ground just as the next shell punched into the spot he had just abandoned. His heart hammered so loud he could feel it in his ears, but there was no time to rest. Shadows moved at the tree line 60 yards out. 8 men, 10 yards spacing, textbook assault formation. He steadied his breathing. The Garand sights were set for longer ranges, but his years in Georgia forests had trained him to compensate instinctively. He swung the rifle ahead of the lead soldier, squeezed the trigger, and watched the man drop mid-stride. Then it became mechanical. Target, adjust, fire, repeat. He worked through the line with practiced rhythm. 5 of the 8 attackers hit the ground before they made it to cover. The last 3 slipped back into the brush. But the pattern didn't stop. It repeated again and again for the next 30 minutes. Small squads would emerge, McKini would hit them at range. Some tried to flank him, others pushed straight in. Every time he shifted position before he could be zeroed in by mortars or rifle fire. The reload cycle became his lifeline. 8 shots, eject, new clip in under 4 seconds. The metallic ping shifted into another tight burst of fire. That speed stunned the attackers there. Bolt-action rifles couldn't match the tempo of a semi-auto Garand handled by someone who had spent his childhood learning to fire faster than his mind could process. By 6:14 a.m., he had burned through 6 clips, 48 rounds gone, and had scattered his spare ammunition across multiple fallback points. He reached a tall termite mound 30 yards away. The structure stood nearly 5 feet high and gave hard cover from nearly every angle. He decided to hold there. If he retreated farther, he would lose access to the ammo he had just fought to collect. He crouched behind the mound, scanning the jungle. The sun was still low, but the light was enough to catch movement. 3 figures burst from the tree line at about 45 yards, sprinting directly toward him. No creeping. No cover, just raw speed. He fired once, center hit at 40 yards. Second round. The next man fell at roughly 35, but the third enemy made it to a rock 15 yards from the termite mound, clutching a grenade. The man yanked the pin and prepared to throw. McKini reacted faster. His round hit the man's chest. The soldier tumbled backward, the grenade slipping out of his hand. It detonated 3 seconds later, carving a crater into the dirt and ending any possibility of the man surviving. Then he heard voices, American voices. A squad of 8 from company headquarters finally reached him at 6:23 a.m., pushing forward after the machine gun position had gone silent. Their leader asked if he was hit. McKini told him he was still able to fight, and that was enough. The squad formed a defensive arc around the termite mound, rifles outward, covering the jungle. A runner sprinted back to report what they had found. One man standing where an entire section of the line should have collapsed. At 6:31 a.m., after 36 minutes of non-stop fighting, the Japanese assault finally broke. Survivors melted into the jungle, retreating toward the Sierra Madre Mountains. The line had held, because one man refused to give up his ground. Full daylight finally hit the battlefield, and the scale of what had happened became impossible to ignore. At 7 a.m., with the smoke clearing and the jungle settling into uneasy silence, a patrol swept the ground around the ruined machine gun pit. They counted bodies where McKini had made his stand. 38 enemy soldiers lay around the emplacement itself. 2 more were found near a knee-mortar, roughly 45 yards away. 40 confirmed kills. The number the Army would officially record. Evidence showed others had been dragged off during the retreat. The real toll was almost certainly higher, but the Americans documented only what they could physically verify. Company A's own casualty list underscored the danger of that pre-dawn assault. 3 dead, 7 wounded, and all of it centered on the one section the Japanese had chosen to break through. Had they succeeded at rolling up that flank, the rest of the 127-man company would have been exposed. The battalion commander later estimated that if the line had collapsed, 50 to 70 Americans would have been lost instantly, and as many as 190 could have been overrun in the following minutes. One rifleman holding that breach changed everything. For the Army, the implications were immediate. McKini was promoted to sergeant, and the wheels were set in motion for a Medal of Honor recommendation. The after-action report emphasized the same fact over and over. From 5:47 a.m. to 6:23 a.m., one soldier using a semi-automatic rifle stopped a reinforced Japanese assault in close quarters, killing 40 attackers at ranges from point blank to 60 yards, and fighting off several in hand-to-hand combat, marksmanship, violence of action, movement under fire, aggression, reload discipline. It was all there, packed into a 36-minute fight. The medal ceremony came months later. On January 23, 1946, at the White House, President Harry Truman presented the Medal of Honor to the quiet Georgia hunter, who had turned a perimeter collapse into a defensive stand. Truman, always blunt, asked him what he planned to do after the Army. McKini replied with the same simplicity that defined him in battle. He wanted to go home and go back to hunting and fishing. Truman smiled and told him men like him were exactly what the country needed. 3 weeks later, McKini was back in Screven County. He didn't marry, didn't seek the spotlight, didn't tour the country as a decorated hero. He slipped back into the same woods where he had learned to shoot as a boy. He hunted deer and turkey. He fished the Savannah River and the same creeks he had grown up wading. He ignored most interview requests and avoided ceremonies. When reporters eventually tracked him down, he would only say that he did what he had to do and that he wanted to forget as much of the war as possible. Decades passed. Then came 1995, the 50th anniversary of the battle on Luzon. Veterans from the 33rd Infantry Division began planning a reunion and wanted their quiet hero there. The problem was finding him. McKini had no telephone. He rarely answered mail. Eventually, one of his old comrades drove into Screven County and asked around among local hunters until he found someone who knew where the former sergeant lived. McKini agreed to go. When he walked into the reunion hall, 50 years melted off the faces of the men who had served beside him. They remembered the dawn assault at Dingalan Bay. They remembered hearing the machine gun go silent and thinking the flank was gone. They remembered expecting to find the line overrun, and instead finding a single soldier bleeding from the head, standing behind a termite mound with a Garand still hot from firing. They told him he had saved their lives. He told them he was glad they made it home. Later that year, the state of Georgia designated State Route 21 through Screven County as the John R. McKini Medal of Honor Highway. McKini attended the dedication ceremony, spoke for barely 3 minutes, and left the crowd with a message that summed up everything about him. Courage wasn't the lack of fear. It was acting anyway, and the men who didn't return deserved the remembrance more than the ones who did. 2 years later, on April 5, 1997, John R. McKini died at age 76. The funeral drew veterans from across the 33rd Infantry Division. They came wearing old unit patches, some carrying canes, others carrying decades of memories. The ceremony was simple. Military honors. A reading from his Medal of Honor citation. 3 rifle volleys cracking across the cemetery, a bugler sounding taps. Then came the detail that froze everyone in place. His M1 Garand, the rifle that had saved 190 men in a jungle 8,000 miles from home, was placed on his casket before it was lowered into the ground. The same rifle that had fired 40 rounds in 36 brutal minutes. The same rifle that had been swung like a club when ammunition wasn't enough. The same rifle that proved a single trained soldier acting decisively could change the course of a battle. Across the country, his story spread quietly among infantry schools, officers, and historians. But at Fort Benning, his actions became part of formal training, a case study in small unit tactics and the raw effectiveness of rapid, semi-automatic fire under pressure. It wasn't mythology, it wasn't exaggeration, it was a lesson. When help isn't coming, fundamentals win fights: movement, stillness, speed, aggression, reloading without hesitation. The same instincts he learned hunting squirrels in Georgia. At Fort Benning's infantry school, instructors began teaching a lesson built around one quiet soldier from Georgia. It wasn't about hero worship, it wasn't about dramatic speeches or cinematic moments. It was about fundamentals, the things infantrymen rely on when the perimeter starts collapsing, and every second becomes a life-or-death calculation. McKini's fight at Dingalan Bay became the centerpiece of that lesson. Cadets studied how he shifted between firing positions every 1 to 2 minutes to avoid getting bracketed by mortars. They broke down how he used cover that stopped small arms fire, how he managed ammunition, how he controlled the pace of the firefight by shooting accurately at 40 to 60 yards, and how he maintained the momentum even when grenades were falling around him. What impressed instructors wasn't superhuman skill. It was the efficiency, the decisiveness, the instinct. His engagement showed that in a close fight, individual marksmanship paired with speed can offset overwhelming numbers. His reload rhythm, 8 rounds, eject, slam a new clip, back in the fight, gave him a rate of fire advantage over bolt-action rifles. That tiny edge, repeated dozens of times across 36 minutes, is what prevented the enemy from flooding through the breach. The Army emphasized a simple truth. The soldier who fires first and moves faster controls the fight. And for 36 minutes, a single man controlled the entire assault. The principles he used were the same ones he learned as a kid. Movement draws fire. Stillness gives opportunity. Quick shots beat perfect shots at close range. And when the enemy is pushing hard, aggression disrupts their planning. On that May morning, those principles weren't abstract theory. They saved 190 Americans holding the lines behind him. As news of his actions spread through military channels, his name became part of doctrinal study. Reenactors, veterans, and historians wrote about him. But while others analyzed every step of the fight, McKini himself refused to elevate his story. If someone asked him what happened, he said only that he remembered flashes in the saber grazing his skull, the machine gun getting grabbed, the constant firing, the constant reloading, the constant movement. The rest, he said, was lost in the noise. For most of his life, McKini avoided attention. He didn't conduct interviews. He declined ceremonies. He didn't sell his story. He didn't try to turn it into a legacy. He lived in the same forests he grew up in, walking the same trails, listening to the same river that had carried him through childhood. But his impact didn't fade. Military instructors pointed to him when teaching new officers the importance of fast decision-making under pressure. Soldiers referenced him during marksmanship discussions about staying calm when shooting under fatigue, and historians highlighted his actions as one of the clearest examples of how a lone defender can stall an overwhelming attack long enough for reinforcements to form a counterline. Even his reload speed, something learned instinctively, not formally, became famous in training circles. Many called it his reload trick, though he never used the word himself. He simply reloaded without thinking, faster than most soldiers could even count their shots. In reality, it wasn't a trick. It was instinct forged from years of hunting animals that disappeared in seconds. That instinct became the difference between life and death for an entire company. But McKini never measured his life by what happened that morning. He preferred the quiet routines of rural Georgia. His neighbors knew him as the man who fished every week, hunted every season, fixed his own gear, and kept to himself. He wasn't a ghost, just a man who didn't need recognition to understand who he was. When he attended the dedication of the highway named in his honor, he stood behind the podium for only 3 minutes. He thanked the state, then told the crowd something he had repeated his whole life. Courage meant acting despite fear, not without it. And the men who had died deserved more credit than he ever would. When he died in 1997, the crowd that gathered was made of the men who understood his silence. Veterans from the 33rd Infantry Division stood shoulder to shoulder as the honor guard fired 3 volleys into the air. Taps echoed over the grass. The chaplain read from the Medal of Honor citation, and then, quietly, the rifle that had carried the weight of a company's survival was placed on his casket. The same M1 Garand that had smashed into an attacker's skull before the sun had even risen. The same rifle that fired 40 confirmed fatal rounds across jungle ground, littered with shattered branches and grenade craters. The same weapon that had been swung like a club when close combat demanded more than ammunition. The rifle was lowered with him, a silent reminder of what one man did when his entire company's left flank collapsed. Today, soldiers still study his engagement because it answers a question every infantryman eventually asks. What happens when you're the only one left between the enemy and your brothers? McKini's answer was clear. You fight fast, you fight smart, you fight until the ground behind you is safe. On that chaotic morning in 1945, 100 attackers pushed toward Dingalan Bay, expecting to break through and roll up an entire perimeter. They didn't get past one man, a man who used every skill he learned as a child. A man who fought with instinct and aggression, a man who reloaded faster than thought, a man who refused to abandon the ground 190 soldiers depended on. He held it. He paid the price in blood and scar, and 40 enemy bodies marked where he stood his ground. Keeping stories like this alive is how we honor the men who carried the kind of weight most of us can only imagine. If this moment hits you somewhere deep, then you already understand how vital it is to keep these forgotten battles breathing on this channel. But here's the question that decides everything. If you stood in McKini's boots alone, outnumbered, and the last line between life and loss, what choice do you